Most NES games knew exactly what they were and stayed there. These didn't. They were doing things the industry wouldn't fully embrace for years. Stealth mechanics, survival horror, hybrid genres, RPG systems bolted onto brawlers. Technical feats that made developers on more powerful hardware take notes. Some of them are legendary. Others are barely known. All of them were operating in a different decade than the one they shipped in. Little Samson shipped in November 1992, by which point the SNES had been in American homes for over a year. They pressed maybe 10,000 cartridges. Almost no one bought it. That commercial failure is why a complete copy costs over $1,000 today, and why the game went virtually undiscussed for a decade before retro communities discovered it and named it among the NES's finest. The dev team were built largely from former Capcom staff, including Akira Kitamura, director of the first two Mega Man games. The lineage shows. For playable characters, Samson, a gliding dragon, a spike-immune golem, and a wall-crawling mouse, are each tuned for specific situations, and the game constantly rewards knowing when to switch rather than treating the roster as cosmetic variety. The graphical work is hardware-defying. Sprite animations are fluid in ways NES games almost never achieved. Backgrounds are dense with minute detail, and massive bosses push the system's sprite limits in ways that drew comparisons to early Genesis titles. The length is the legitimate complaint. Little Samson is short, and while the difficulty curve is well calibrated for its runtime, players will find the experience over before it properly accelerates. Certain late-game sections reuse level elements in ways that suggest a budget constraint rather than deliberate design. For what it achieves within those limits, a precisely engineered, late-era platformer with production values that embarrassed everything else on the platform. It would have been a landmark title if there had been anyone left in stores to buy it. The NES version of Metal Gear is a port that Hideo Kojima disowned. Different levels, missing content, developed without his involvement. But even in that form, what it was doing in 1988 had no precedent in mainstream gaming. Every other action game put you in control of a powerful soldier who fought through. Metal Gear reversed the premise. You started unarmed, and violence was the wrong approach. Alert states sent reinforcements flooding your screen. Cameras guard line of sight, and suppressor mechanics had to be understood and worked around. Codec radio communication delivered a narrative layer no other 8-bit game was building. The original MSX2 version, where the real design lives, goes further. Kojima built the stealth concept from hardware limitation. The MSX couldn't render many enemies, so he designed a game around avoiding them. Solid Snake hid in cardboard boxes, attached suppressors to weapons, wore gas masks through poison rooms. There were fourth wall breaks where enemies told you to turn off your console. The entire DNA of a franchise that would redefine gaming in 1998, the evasion tension, the cinematic storytelling, the tactical depth, is present here on hardware that shipped 11 years before Metal Gear Solid. The NES port specifically struggles. Level designs were changed arbitrarily, key items lack context, and navigating without a guide leaves players completely stuck. For anyone approaching it today, the MSX original with its restored translation is the right version. The NES port's argument is simpler. It sold 1 million copies in the United States in 1988. 1 million American players bought a stealth game before the genre had a name. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is probably the most misunderstood game in its franchise's history and one of the most genuinely ambitious NES cartridges ever made. Nintendo released it in 1987 and threw out the top-down formula entirely. The new Zelda was a side-scrolling action RPG where Link gained experience points, leveled up 3 separate stats, learned a spell repertoire from wise men in fully populated towns, navigated an overworld map with visible enemy encounters that could be dodged, and dueled enemies in combat where crouching and shield positioning changed outcomes. Towns had named citizens who gave actual direction. Hyrule existed as a constructed world rather than a maze. What made it genuinely ahead of its time was the combat design. Iron Knuckles had defensive stances, attack patterns, and exploitable openings. Getting through them required reading behavior and responding, which in 1987 was closer to what fighting games would later formalize than anything else on the NES. The shadow fight at the game's end, facing a dark mirror of Link, is a boss design philosophy later decades would develop into entire mechanical languages. The punishments didn't age as gracefully. A game over sends you to the beginning of the map regardless of how far you progressed, which existed because save technology was limited, not because it made design sense. The final dungeon difficulty spike is brutal without much warning. But the systems underneath those frustrations were decades ahead, and the games that eventually mined action RPG design owe more to Zelda 2 than most of them acknowledge. The Guardian Legend answers a question nobody had thought to ask in 1988. What if Legend of Zelda's overworld exploration and Gradius-style vertical shooter corridors existed in the same game, with a protagonist who transformed seamlessly between modes? The result is something Game Informer would later call the ultimate genre bender, a hybrid so complete that it took decades for anyone to seriously attempt something comparable. Compile built Naju as a non-linear alien planet across 22 shooter corridors interspersed with open adventure. In exploration mode, the Guardian moves on foot through diverse environments, collecting weapons, fighting enemies in 8 directions, and solving environmental puzzles to unlock corridor entrances. Entering a corridor triggers the transformation into a fighter ship and shifts the game into dense vertical shooter territory, with screen-filling bullet patterns and massive bosses. Weapons carry between modes. The two halves intertwine completely. The difficulty creates a real barrier. Shooter stages punish players who didn't optimize weapon loadouts in adventure sections, and certain corridors are vicious without preparation. The North American password system used an unusual font that made characters nearly indistinguishable, which contributed to the game never finding the audience it deserved. IGN ranked it among the most influential NES games ever made, and the community around it has only grown, but at launch it quietly became the greatest sleeper the platform produced, too ambitious for its own marketing, too good to stay unknown forever. Sweet Home is a 1989 Famicom RPG that most Western players have never experienced, because Capcom kept it in Japan. The reasons are visible everywhere in the game. It is genuinely disturbing. 5 filmmakers enter a mansion to find old frescoes. The door locks behind them. What follows is the first real survival horror game. Scattered diary entries driving environmental storytelling. Limited item inventory creating resource tension. Multiple endings depending on which character survive. Permanent death when someone falls in battle, and puzzles requiring backtracking with newly discovered tools. Every single one of those mechanics went directly into Resident Evil, because Resident Evil began as a Sweet Home remake. Capcom lost the film rights and built an original story around the same systems. The 5 characters each carry unique starting items: a vacuum, a lighter, a candle, a first aid kit, and progression requires each tool in specific situations. Losing a character meant losing their tool permanently, which gave players genuine reason to keep everyone alive beyond simple sentimentality. The mansion is built as a place with actual history that players uncover rather than a game space they navigate. Story arrives through corpse descriptions and wall writings rather than cutscenes. The random battle rate wears on players over a long session, and the interface is clunky even by Famicom standards. Neither flaw changes what Sweet Home accomplished in 1989 on hardware with severe limitations. It built a horror experience that still holds tension today, which is more than most games from any generation can claim. That it had to wait for fan translators in 2000 to reach Western players makes it one of the most significant games nobody got to play. Crystalis arrived in 1990 and looked like a Zelda clone until you played it for 20 minutes. The action RPG genre was still new, and most games in it made you choose between combat feel and systemic depth. SNK refused and built a game with 4 elemental swords, each capable of charged projectile attacks, each upgradable through 2 separate items found across the world, layered on top of a full RPG framework of experience, levels, shops, spells, and named NPCs with actual story to deliver. The post-apocalyptic sci-fi setting drew from Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, presenting a world where civilization had collapsed and rebuilt around a misunderstood magic that was actually lost technology. The charge mechanic predates A Link to the Past and Secret of Mana by 2 and 3 years respectively. Those SNES games refined the formula. This established it. The elemental system required genuine strategic engagement. Wrong sword against the wrong enemy dealt 0 damage, not reduced damage. The game was explicitly telling players that matching your tools to your situation mattered, which was an unusual demand for the NES era. The real shortcoming is the interface. Only 2 buttons exist, and Crystalis mapped magic to the same button as secondary items, with magic always taking priority. Understanding what items do requires trial, and error the game doesn't explain. Many players hit progression walls because they couldn't figure out how to use a specific item sitting in their inventory the whole time. The world is stunning, the combat satisfying, and the story genuinely ambitious for 1990. The controls are the one system that didn't come along with the rest of it. Faxanadu reached North America in 1989, and it was doing something aesthetically that almost no other NES game attempted, fully committing to a dying world. The entire game takes place inside a world tree that is rotting from a poison meteor strike. The color palette shifts as you climb higher, warm browns at the base, diseased grays toward the summit, ending in a mist-choked zone of disorienting purple-gray fog that was genuinely eerie for 8-bit hardware. The music follows the same arc, beginning with adventurous tones that grow progressively stranger the further in you go. It combined side-scrolling action, RPG progression through weapon and armor purchases, a magic system, meaningful NPC dialogue, and a world structure that felt interconnected rather than stage select. The Death Warp mechanic, where dying returned you to the last town with experience converted to gold, meant failure still moved you forward. The experience system was itself unusual, gaining levels granted currency rather than stats, forcing engagement with the economy rather than simple grinding. That loop felt cohesive in a way most NES RPGs didn't manage. The weaknesses are real. Jump physics are floaty and imprecise, creating friction where precision matters most. The key purchasing system, where dungeons have locked doors and keys must be bought at shops, creates backtracking that feels arbitrary rather than designed. Bosses are occasionally trivial, but the atmosphere Faxanadu achieves on 8-bit hardware is genuine, and the interconnected world structure it built inside a single giant tree predates the Metroidvania genre that later decades would fully formalize. Kirby's Adventure shipped in May 1993. The Super Nintendo had been in North American homes for nearly 2 years. Most developers had moved on. HAL Laboratory hadn't, and what they shipped on a dying platform was among the most technically accomplished games the NES ever produced. The hardware flex is documented. Rotating three-dimensional tower segments, smooth parallax scrolling across multiple depth layers, large and fluidly animated sprites, an automatic battery save in a genre still using passwords, and over 24 copy abilities, each with animations and movesets of their own. Programmers with a decade of inexperience were extracting capabilities that would have seemed impossible in the console's first years. At points, the game appears to be doing things the hardware shouldn't allow. But the system underneath was also genuinely innovative. The copyability framework, inhale an enemy, absorb their power, deploy it as your own, was the foundation of an entire franchise's identity and a mechanic that games are still exploring today. It allowed the same stage to be approached completely differently based on which power you carried in, created organic discovery, and gave replayability to a genre that typically didn't offer it. The overworld map, optional mini-boss rooms, collectible completion percentage, and hidden switches predated design vocabulary the 16-bit era would codify as standard. But the difficulty is generally low. Kirby's hover ability dissolves most platforming challenges, and enemies fold quickly through most of the game. The final bosses spike appropriately, but the road there doesn't test much. For a game this polished arriving this late on outgoing hardware, that criticism feels almost beside the point. Gunnak is a 1990 vertical shooter by Compile, and it represents that studio pushing the NES hardware to a ceiling very few games approached. The technical achievement is specific, up to 20 sprites simultaneously with flicker reduced to near imperceptible levels, no noticeable slowdown through the densest bullet sequences, a consistent 60 frames per second throughout. Compile used advanced sprite management and hand-optimized assembly to achieve performance on an 8-bit CPU that the platform's other shooters simply couldn't match. The design wraps this technical work in gleeful absurdism. Earth colonists are attacked by sentient mutated animals and household objects and must be repelled by a lone commander. Compile built 8 stages of varied encounter design around the premise, with a mid-stage mini-boss structure, a between-stage shop where currency buys upgrades and bombs, 5 primary weapons with distinct tactical profiles, and a wing upgrade system that grants a spare hit point while enabling higher weapon tiers. Power-ups drop frequently enough to feel generous without removing challenge. The default difficulty is gentle. Experienced shooter players can clear it on a first attempt, which is a fair criticism. The tone also shifts inconsistently in later stages, trending toward generic sci-fi as the absurdist enemies phase out. A game that opened by sending giant rabbits at you from the moon deserves a weirder ending than a Metal Fortress. That aside, what Compile demonstrated in 1990 remains remarkable. Careful programming made the NES produce shooter performance genuinely competitive with hardware it had no business rivaling. River City Ransom shipped in 1989 as a beat-em-up wearing the skin of a completely different kind of game. The brawler genre had a simple identity: scroll right, punch enemies, reach the end. River City Ransom took that and added a non-linear open world you traversed freely, a full RPG stat system where every enemy dropped money for spending at shops and restaurants on permanent upgrades, a book-based move purchase system where new combat techniques could be unlocked, and 2-player co-op where partners could design their build around complementary roles. In 1989, Double Dragon was the genre benchmark. River City Ransom was already treating that benchmark as a starting floor. The stats system is what made it genuinely unusual. Buying a bowl of ramen raised your vitality. A specific book taught your character a spin kick. Another upgraded your throw. Items could be stored and used in the field. The world had malls with distinct shops, parks, side alleys, and a school housing the final confrontation, all connected by a map you navigated at will. This is open-world brawling in 1989, predating the genre's mainstream embrace by roughly 2 decades. The grind is real. Enemy respawn rates are high enough that the money loop can feel monotonous, and maxing stats requires repetition that outlasts the game's variety. The password system used to save progress is notoriously unwieldy, a dense string of alphanumeric characters prone to transcription errors. Some mid-game bosses are damage sponges that outpace your progression. None of that erases what the design achieved. River City Ransom was not content to be the best version of the genre it entered. It wanted to be something else entirely, and largely pulled off.